Havana, Cuba. A beautiful city, but a city stuck in time. A city that was basically off limits to Americans for 55 years. You could even get your passport revoked if you tried to go there. Today, things are a bit different. There are 6 flights a day between Miami and La Habana, and American Airlines is now the largest airline in the city. They operate about twice as many flights a week as the flag carrier of Cuba, a company called Cubana de Aviación. Cubana is tiny. They have just a handful of aircraft in operation, and they fly to less than 10 destinations. We don't know a ton about their finances, but I think it's safe to say they aren't profitable. Just like Iran Air, Syrian Air, and Conviasa, they faced crippling sanctions that limited their ability to buy new aircraft and spare parts. They were barred from flying to their most profitable destinations, boxed out of the global financial system, and forced out of lease agreements that would have given them access to newer aircraft. Today, Cubana is on life support and it's running out of options. Heck, it's getting lapped by the competition on its home turf. It's sad to see, because Cubana was once one of the most powerful and influential airlines in the world. It was founded by the same guy that founded TWA, a one Mr. Clement Melville Keyes. Over the course of the 1940s and 1950s, its growth was fueled by none other than Pan Am, who owned 100% of the airline for over a decade. By the mid-1950s, La Habana was emerging as a formidable strategic hub. Cubana positioned La Habana as a bridge between continents, sort of like Copa does with La Ciudad de Panama today. You could travel to 20 destinations in Cuba, 26 destinations abroad, as close as Miami, and as far as Madrid. Your chariots ranged in size and stature from the relatively pedestrian, shorter-range DC-3 to the more modern and luxurious long-haul Pioneer, otherwise known as the Lockheed Supercharging. Cubana was an innovator in the region. They were a founding member of IATA, they were the first airline in Latin America to operate turboprops, and it's very likely they would have been the first airline in Latin America to operate the 707 if the revolution hadn't happened in 1959. But then, well, the revolution happened in 1959. The US cut off all trade with Cuba in 1962, which meant Boeing and Lockheed could no longer do business with Cubana. The Soviets were happy to step in, supplying Ilyushins, Antonovs, and Tupolevs. Today, I think a lot of us just assume these Soviet planes were inferior to Western-built aircraft. And it's mostly true. Soviet planes were notoriously unreliable. Their engines needed more maintenance, and their fuel efficiency was abysmal. But they could put up some pretty impressive raw performance stats. Take the Tupolev 114. This was a 4-engine turboprop that could fly as fast as a jet and could travel 6,800 miles non-stop. This enabled Cubana to offer non-stop flights between La Habana and the Soviet Union. It was operated by Aeroflot, but still a pretty impressive feat, taking the cake for the world's longest commercial non-stop flight by a mile. That was something they would not have been able to do with any Western-built aircraft, but at the same time, if Castro hadn't seized power, they wouldn't have had any reason to fly non-stop to the Soviet Union. That brings us to an important point. Ever since Cubana was nationalized, all incentives to turn a profit went out the window. Gone were the ambitions for growth and prestige. Cubana's primary mission pivoted to sovereignty and geopolitical survival. It was essentially a flying embassy for Cuban and Soviet government officials, military advisors, technicians, and engineers. It was Cuba's way to break the blockade, to prove to the West that it could survive sanctions at really any cost. And color me surprised, Soviet support actually led to a bit of a renaissance for Cubana in the 1970s and 1980s, at least in terms of their international profile. The Il-62 worked wonders for them, allowing them to spread their wings to places like Paris, Madrid, Berlin, and Prague. Now, there's no way they were making money on those flights, but their sheer presence lent some legitimacy to the Castro regime and the whole socialist bromance between Cuba and the Soviets. In due time, the Soviets would self-destruct and we'd see Cubana realign with Russia. This led to a whole new set of opportunities and challenges, but the common theme was this airline was still a government-run company in a command economy, and therefore never even got close to achieving its full potential. I really believe that the blueprint for a strong Cubana lies in the pre-revolution days. So let's do what we always do and rewind the clock to a time when everything was still black and white. Alright, well, I think we're going to start with a little black and white filter because some of you are probably very confused. Peter, what on earth are you doing making a video about Cubana? You're not Cuban, you've never been to Cuba, and you've certainly never flown Cubana. And you would be correct. I have zero authority to be commenting on this matter, but you guys seem to like these airline history videos, so we're just gonna send it. I also do need to finish up our story on Iran Air, but I got a little sidetracked, so we're gonna detour over to Cuba, and then we'll head back over to the Middle East. So we begin our story in the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, as it was called. The war was over, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and the economy was booming. People were moving from farms to cities, they were buying cars for the first time, and they were flipping light switches in their homes for the first time. America's GDP grew about 42% from 1920 to 1929, which is about 4% per year. In Cuba, there was prosperity, but it was precarious. See, the country's economy was built almost entirely on sugar production. A massive crash in sugar prices early in the decade wiped out many Cuban banks and businesses. A good number of them were bailed out by US companies, either via debt or equity infusions, meaning that over time the Americans came to own much of the Cuban economy. Meanwhile, La Habana transformed into a global playground for tourism. With alcohol banned in the US, Cuba was the closest place Americans could go to let loose. La Habana became the Paris of the Caribbean. Americans flocked to the country en masse to drink, gamble, and party. Air service between Florida and Cuba started in 1920. The first flights were between Key West and La Habana, but service was later moved to Miami for greater passenger convenience. By 1929, Cuba was pretty well connected internationally, but it lacked any real domestic air network. This is where Mr. Clement Melville Keyes saw an opportunity. Mr. Keyes was the president of Curtiss-Wright Aircraft Company, an American aircraft manufacturer with big ambitions to expand globally. Cuba would help them achieve that, but it would also help them achieve a broader strategic vision. Curtiss-Wright wanted to start training pilots and operating airlines, effectively controlling the entire aviation value chain. This is what they called vertical integration. Mr. Keyes already had a flying school in Cuba, and there was a growing number of well-trained pilots, so he just needed to supply the planes and get the government approvals, which didn't take too long. In October of 1930, Curtiss's new airline took to the skies. They were called Compañía Nacional Cubana de Aviación Curtiss, a real mouthful. But the Curtiss name was prominent in the branding, a very intentional move. They started operations with the Curtiss Robin, a teeny high-wing monoplane that carried at most 2 passengers. This was a legendary aircraft that set multiple world records, most notably flying for 27 days straight in 1935, utilizing mid-air refueling. As an aside, mid-air refueling was not automated in 1935. You literally had a guy hanging off the side of the tanker plane trying to align and secure the fuel line. People were so much braver back then. Cubana did not intend to push the limits of the Robin. They operated exclusively daytime flights, no more than 200 to 300 miles on any given sector, and they carried almost exclusively cargo, specifically mail. For a while, Cubana's flights were essentially postal service that happened to have room for a couple brave, wealthy passengers. And they were very good at what they did. They were reliable and they were safe. Their daytime flights between La Habana and Santiago were almost always on time, and this made their customers very happy. However, come 1932, Curtiss-Wright was in financial trouble. They needed to raise cash, so they sold Cubana to none other than Pan Am, who actually had a very compelling strategic case to buy the airline. Cubana would help Pan Am get their customers to more cities in Cuba. Pan Am would bring wealthy tourists from Miami to La Habana, and Cubana would then fly those same tourists to the sprawling sugar estates or the historic cities in the east. With Pan Am's backing, Cubana grew into a formidable domestic force. During the mid-30s, they acquired Lockheed Electras, some of the most modern planes around. These supplemented the Ford trimotors that had been supplied by Pan Am. Notably, both planes were metal aircraft, and they could land on grass, gravel, or dirt. These attributes enabled them to withstand Cuba's humidity and also conquer its many airports with unpaved runways. By 1940, the fleet had grown to around 12 aircraft, still ferrying primarily mail between La Habana and Santiago, but a lot more mail. As the exclusive domestic mail carrier for the island of Cuba, they carried 100 to 150,000 pounds of mail annually. Now, to be technically correct, it wasn't all mail per se, but if it was all mail, that would be equivalent to 3 to 4 million individual letters. Being a cargo carrier wasn't the most sexy, but it was steady, it was predictable, and it was profitable. It sheltered Pan Am from swings and seasonality in its passenger business, all while giving them exposure to and influence in international markets. During World War II, Cubana had to put its growth plans on hold. Aircraft production shifted primarily to military aircraft like B-17s and C-47s, meaning Cubana couldn't really buy new aircraft. Aviation fuel was hard to come by because it was being rationed for military use. Even though Cuba itself wasn't a battlefield, the Caribbean was a strategic gold mine for the Allied forces, so Germany deployed up to 100 U-boats to the Caribbean seas to try to cut off supplies of key resources like oil to the US. Cuba became a base for anti-submarine warfare, and Cubana helped facilitate the transport of personnel and supplies between various military bases on the island. Towards the end of the war, Pan Am sold about 48% of the company to private Cuban investors. They needed to raise cash to fund their ambitious post-war expansion plans, and they realized they didn't really need to own Cubana outright to exert their influence. Cubana was arguably better off as well. Now, with almost half of the company owned by Cuban interests, they could present themselves as the sovereign national flag carrier of the country, and that's exactly what they did. In 1944, they represented Cuba at the Chicago Convention, which formed ICAO, and in 1945, they became a founding member of IATA, in none other than La Habana itself. After the war, Cubana really started to take off. Their new ownership structure allowed them to finally launch international flights on their own. They began La Habana to Miami service in 1945 with the DC-3, and La Habana to Madrid service in 1948 with the DC-4. 5 years later, they added New York, which was a big deal. They flew the route with Lockheed Superconnies on loan from Pan Am. The Superconnie was the pinnacle of piston engine technology, offering unmatched speed and cabin comfort, and it was rare for an airline as small as Cubana to have access to it. Some of the Superconnies were more than just planes. They were flying nightclubs. Cubana launched what they called the Tropicana Special in 1955. These were party flights between Miami and La Habana in collaboration with La Habana's famous Club Tropicana. Upon leaving Miami at 7:50 p.m., passengers were immediately treated to live music, showgirls, daiquiris, and of course, Cuban cigars. Cubana's ability to craft a memorable experience for its guests was unmatched, and for that reason, it continued to grow its base of loyal passengers. Now, don't get me wrong, they had nowhere near the scale as their American counterpart. Pan Am was flying a couple million people per year, but they punched way above their weight for a country of their size, carrying just over 220,000 passengers in 1955. In 1954, Pan Am sold the remainder of its stake, but that didn't stop Cubana from pursuing its ambitions. In 1955, they introduced the Vickers Viscount, a true revolution in technology. The Viscount was the world's first turboprop airliner. It was pressurized, it flew higher, it flew faster, and passengers loved it. The Viscounts were deployed primarily on short-haul international routes, but also saw some action to Santiago, which was the flagship domestic destination out of La Habana. Cuba's tourism industry was booming. La Habana was the Vegas of the Caribbean, attracting hundreds of thousands of thrill seekers every year. In the mid-50s, Cuba accounted for 30% of all tourist arrivals in the Caribbean region. The air travel market was one of the most mature in the region, and it was big enough to support not only Cubana, but 3 other airlines. A company by the name of Airlines was Cubana's biggest rival. Their specialty was high-frequency shuttle flights between La Habana and South Florida. However, unlike Cubana, they flew into Key West, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm. They were smaller, but they were a disruptor, experimenting with principles that today's low-cost carriers popularized in the 1970s and 1980s. Flying with Airlines was more affordable than Cubana, it was often more convenient, and because of this, it grew its passenger base to a respectable 150,000 a year at its peak. La Habana was a bit of an anomaly compared to the rest of Cuba. In smaller cities, towns, and rural areas, Cuba's ordinary citizens were struggling. The sugar harvest only lasted about 4 months out of the year, and this meant that many rural workers spent the rest of the year unemployed. People were barely making enough money to get by, and living conditions were rough. No electricity, no running water, and very minimal basic schooling. Wealth was uneven. Prosperity was uneven. And a man named Fidel Castro was able to harness all the discontent to overthrow the government. But it didn't happen overnight. Castro had been building a following since Batista's military coup in 1952. He was prisoned, he was exiled, and when he returned in 1956, it took 3 more years of guerrilla warfare and grassroots efforts to finally bring down the incumbent government. During this time, Cubana became a strategic target and a tool for the rebels. It was portrayed as a vehicle for Cuba's elite and American gamblers, 2 factions the rebels very much wanted to destroy. So between 1958 and 1959, Cubana was sort of sucked into the battle, with a quarter of its fleet impacted by rebel activity. Hijackings were a pretty powerful tool. They gave the rebels means to transport weapons and ammunition to their bases, but they also generated major international publicity for the rebels and caused major disruptions to Cubana's operations. With the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cubana was immediately targeted for reform. Castro nationalized the airline, then forcibly merged it with all the other private operators, Aeroviescu, Cuba Aeropostal, and Expreso Airways. There would now be one sole national airline, and it would retain the name Cubana de Aviación. The most immediate impact to Cubana was the wave of refugees fleeing the country. Cubana continued to fly its Miami, New York, and Madrid routes for a couple years before the major diplomatic fallouts. So between 1959 and 1962, approximately 250,000 Cubans left the island. The vast majority did not flee on rafts. They left legally on commercial Cubana or Pan Am flights. Castro allowed this for a while, but later began a policy of confiscating property of anyone who boarded a flight with an exit permit. One thing Castro did not want was a mass crew exodus. This was tough because much of Cubana's staff was either loyal to or aligned with the guy who just got overthrown, and they were concerned for their well-being under the Castro regime. Castro knew this, and he actually stationed army guards on Cubana aircraft to prevent defections. Despite Castro's efforts, Cubana crews executed multiple self-hijackings, overpowering the onboard guards or Castro-aligned personnel, then rerouting planes to the US or disappearing once they hit US soil. Cubana aircraft became the most hijacked planes in the world during this time. So after the initial refugee wave, demand for their services basically collapsed. One of Castro's first actions had been to shut down the hotels, casinos, and brothels that had made La Habana the Latin Las Vegas. Tourism was seen by the new government as an imperialist decadence. But it wasn't just tourism infrastructure. Castro also seized sugar mills and oil refineries, many of them majority owned by American interests. The US retaliated with a total trade embargo, refusing to buy Cuban sugar and refusing to ship the country oil. The Cubans had no choice but to turn to the Soviets to fill the void, and this kicked off a painful transition for the country, both its people and its airline. The Soviet Union wasn't exactly close, more than 6,000 miles between capitals. While the US could ship goods to Cuba in less than a day, it took Soviet tankers roughly 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Any disruptions, weather, mechanical failures, seizures by American ships, would cause immediate fuel shortages in Cuba. Flight schedules became notoriously unpredictable, with the fuel issue as well as mechanical issues, because Cubana no longer had access to spare parts from American companies. Luckily, they didn't rely exclusively on American-made aircraft, which softened the blow initially. Remember, they had British-made Viscounts as well as Bristol Britannias. Trade with Britain was initially okay, but it didn't really matter. Any Western-built aircraft were going to be tough to maintain because Western-trained engineers left Cuba and the Brits ultimately caved to US pressure to not support the country. In Cubana's next incarnation, we'd see it shift to Soviet-built aircraft, with the first example arriving in late 1961. This is a pretty interesting chapter, and we'll take a look at it in more depth in the next video. In the meantime, hope everyone is having a great start to 2026, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.